good evening and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video looking into the life of one of the most famous explorers of the mid-19th century, John McDouall Stuart, whose name is carried across the plains of Central Australia. I mean, literally, there are so many things that are named after him, and there are a number of statues dedicated to his legacy of exploration across Central Australia. But what are the finite details? What are the moments of his life that are carried throughout this legacy? Let's find out. Stuart found himself in South Australia in 1839, some 2 years after Adelaide was founded as a settlement. And he found employ with Charles Stuart. Stuart had already made a name for himself between 1828 and 1830, navigating the Murray River and one of the tributaries of the Darling River. But McDouall Stuart was lucky enough in 1844 to accompany the Surveyor General on his third and final expedition to find the centre of the continent and to find this elusive inland sea that had been conjured up in the imaginations of explorers everywhere. Along with a 15-man team, Stuart brought along with him 7 wagons with all the provisions and resources that he thought would be required, and 1 boat. Stuart and his team would leave Adelaide, marked by this plaque at the bank of Adelaide, on the 10th of August in 1844, and travelled across the Murray and Darling rivers to the base camp nearly 2 months later, which is near the modern township of Menindee. For the next 4 months, Stuart and his team would navigate and survey the area around their base camp, Lake Corndelia, and more further to the north, the Grey Ranges. Now, the closer you get to the centre of Australia, the hotter the climate gets. And Stuart and his team were travelling in this area at the height of Australian summer, the height of its great heat. In February 1845, Stuart decided to create a depot named Fort Grey, where he would stay for the next 6 months, camped out, waiting for the heat to die down and for the cooler winter months to come to pass. In August 1845, Stuart wasted no time trying again to head towards the centre of Australia. And he got very close indeed. On the 9th of September 1845, there is an extract made in the journals of Charles Stuart.
Halted at sunrise in a country such as, I firmly believe, has no parallel on Earth's surface. We stopped near a few acacia bushes, without food since we left the creek on the 6th. Now on the evening of the 8th, we encamped a second night without water.
But the teams could go no further. The further they travelled through to the centre of Australia, the less and less water sources were available to them. They touched the Great Stony Desert and the very edges of the Simpson Desert during the August to September period, and forced to turn back around and back to Fort Grey. In October 45, Charles Stuart tried again, but instead of going through the Stony Desert like he had before, he decided to take a more due north approach and try and get further still than he had before. But by the end of that month, his health was starting to fail him. He was suffering from malnutrition and scurvy, and his surgeon, John Harris, had to take command of the situation. Meanwhile, Stuart's number 2, second in command, a man by the name of James Poole, died during the expedition. So John McDouall Stuart, who had already been serving as a draftsman, was bumped up to number 2, the second in command of the expedition. In the November of 1845, Stuart's expedition team arrived back at their original base camp that they had set up a year before. And having travelled 3,000 miles, they arrived back in the city of Adelaide in early 1846. Many of the public and the South Australian government had believed that Stuart and his team had died en route during their expedition. And whilst they had not passed away or suffered that consequence, they were in pretty poor health. And McDouall Stuart didn't work for another year whilst he recovered from the malnutrition and scurvy that had afflicted him during this expedition. Statues of both Charles Sturt and John McDouall Stuart are located in the Victoria Square in Adelaide, and this goes to show the connection between the two explorers and their legacies towards the exploration and the navigation of Central Australia. For the next 10 years, John McDouall Stuart would go back to being the private surveyor that he had been before 1844, working in the lofty ranges and these remote areas of Australia, due north of the city of Adelaide and due east of Port Augusta. But by 1858, John McDouall Stuart would go on to undertake 6 expeditions over a 4-year period, resourced by the Chambers brothers, who would go on to be great patrons of his, John and James Chambers, who were pastoralists just north of Port Augusta. The first 3 expeditions were surveying expeditions, like he probably would have done in the 10 years prior. But the final 3 were more lofty and more ambitious, and probably taking the most toll on the individual and individuals at hand. McDouall Stuart left on his first expedition on the 14th of May 1858 from the Oratunga station, owned by the Chambers brothers, just east of Lake Torrens, right here. He had enough provisions for roughly a month, and accompanying him were a man by the name of Forster, as well as one of the locals who knew the area quite well. Their mission, as they travelled round to the west of the Lake Torrens and then further up, was to find mineral deposits and further lands for pastoral leasing. As McDouall Stuart arrived at this northerly point just here, he found a small creek and named it after his patrons, Chambers Creek. Continuing further east and then northeast, the company of men arrived very close to the site of Coober Pedy. However, McDouall Stuart would not know that there were opals, rich veins of opals, to be found in this local area here surrounding Coober Pedy. It wouldn't be until the early 20th century that anybody would start to dig. By this point in the expedition, the provisions that had been provided by the Chambers brothers were starting to run low. And suffering from scurvy and malnutrition, Stuart decided as team leader to reluctantly to head south. Forster accompanied him, but the local guide decided to leave the 2 men to it. They eventually arrived back at what they believed to be civilization in the October of 1858. McDouall Stuart became intrigued by the prospect of the area surrounding Chambers Creek, and so he applied for a pastoral lease from the South Australian government, and even said that he would do the surveying himself, having the necessary skills to do so. So, in April 1859, he began from the Oratunga station once again and travelled north around the eastern side of the Lake Torrens. He scattered about a bit in this area just north of the lake, and even goes so far as to do a little small searching party, before going northeast, near enough in a straight line, and then sort of coming straight back down again. He came very close to the area known as Oodnadatta, which is roughly about here, but he obviously wouldn't discover or settle in this particular area. But in the latter half of 1859, there came a problem. A man by the name of Benjamin Babbage said that the areas that had been surveyed and claimed, especially in this northeastern section by McDouall Stuart, were actually his claim and pastoral land to lease. So McDouall Stuart had to resurvey the land surrounding Chambers Creek, but instead decided to head north, around towards Lake Eyre and sections near here, and near enough going close once again to the township, or the soon-to-be township, of Oodnadatta. But upon arriving back at Chambers Creek in January 1860, many of the men that had served on this latest expedition refused to go any further. Their rations had been cut by half per day, their health was in general decline, and John McDouall Stuart's own health was poor, and his right eye was suffering from a mild blindness, and so general morale was at an all-time low. McDouall Stuart sent those that wanted to go back home and sent William Keckwick out to find more people to make up the difference for a new expedition. On the 2nd of March 1860, McDouall Stuart once again left from Chambers Creek with his previous compatriot William Keckwick and new man Benjamin Head. They had with them 3 months' worth of provisions and 13 horses. Travel light and travel fast was Stuart's order of the day. As Stuart headed north, up towards the area near Oodnadatta, a heavy rain set in, which spoiled over half the provisions. So the 3-man expedition team were down to half rations per day. And as they got closer and closer to the centre of Australia, they came across the McDouall Ranges, the border of South Australia. It was named after Richard Graves McDouall, who was the South Australian governor at the time. They arrived at the ranges on the 12th of April 1860, and roughly 10 days later they would go on to discover the centre of Australia, something which Stuart's predecessor, Charles Sturt, had once strived for in 1844 to 46. McDouall Stuart would write in his journals with a calm sense of composure that he was now camped at the centre of the continent, at the centre of Australia. He would then turn his attention to what he would call the Central Mount Sturt, named after his mentor Charles Sturt. Very quickly after the traversal of this mountain in 1860, its namesake was changed from the Central Mount Sturt to the Central Mount Stuart, to recognise the legacy of Stuart's work in exploring the centre of Australia. By the May of 1860, they were spurred on a little bit further because of the high level of rains that occurred, and got so far as to the area near to what is called Tennant Creek. But as they progressed north, some 3,000 kilometres away, they came across an area called Attack Creek. It is called Attack Creek because Stuart's party were attacked by local individuals in this Northern Territory region. And so, seeing that they were unable to go any further without some form of armed force, the party were forced to turn back again, back to Adelaide, arriving in October of 1860. But let's just shift gears for one moment, because by 1860, the South Australian government were very intrigued to connect the wider Australian continent with the rest of the world via a telegraph network. They had offered a £2,000 reward to any explorer that could traverse through the centre to the top northern coastline of the continent. The government had funded a couple of expeditions of their own, but they had failed to even get anywhere near the centre of Australia. And they didn't consider John McDouall Stuart as enough of a great explorer to be given such a lofty mission. But when McDouall Stuart returned to Adelaide at the end of his 4th expedition, the South Australian government reluctantly honoured him to a public breakfast in what were known as the White Rooms, which is now where the Majesty's Theatre stands today. They also decided to government fund a 5th expedition so that McDouall Stuart could continue his traversal through the centre to the northern point of the continent. This money would go on to pay for 10 armed guards, 44 horses, and nearly 8 months' worth of provisions. The provisions and horses were supplied, as per usual, by the Chambers brothers. On the 1st of January 1861, McDouall Stuart left Chambers Creek with his armed guards and his 8 months of provisions, and followed near enough the same route that had been taken the year before on his previous 4th expedition. The early rains in January and February meant that travel was quite fast as they moved towards the centre. But as they progressed further into the centre and up towards the more arid aspects of the country, water became very scarce, and there were constant needs to dart left and right, alternating from the path to find water for themselves and their horses. They arrived at what they called Attack Creek in the April of 1861, but with no hassle and no problems in that area, they continued on, getting so far
as Newcastle Waters, or what is now called Newcastle Waters. Exactly 6 months after leaving Chambers Creek, John McDouall Stuart decided to turn the expedition back around. They were running out of provisions, they were suffering from poor health, and although they had managed to get past Attack Creek with no hassle, the locals in the northern sections of the area were not too friendly by their European standards, and so they had to escape the Northern Territory.
Upon returning back to Adelaide in September 1861, the South Australian government were very reluctant to send John McDouall Stuart on another 6th expedition to the northern coastline of Australia. If he hadn't managed it on this 5th attempt, on this 5th expedition, who was to say that it was going to work on this 6th try? But after a last-minute pull of the ear, the government managed to give John McDouall Stuart £2,000 for a 9-month provisioned expedition to the northern coastline of Australia, on the condition that a government scientist employee was sent along with the expedition team, with John McDouall Stuart and his number 2, William Keckwick. The 6th and final expedition that John McDouall Stuart would undertake, and his 3rd attempt at crossing the Australian continent, began from northern Adelaide at John Chambers' house on the 25th of October 1861. Crossed to the Chambers Orotunga station and up north, and arrived at Chambers Creek towards the end of that year. They would not leave Chambers Creek until January the 8th of 1862, but they would make very good time, arriving, or darting, practically sprinting, up to Newcastle Waters by the April of 1862. 3 months later, on July the 24th, 1862, they would arrive 100 kilometres east of what we now consider the city of Darwin, to a place that McDouall Stuart would call Chambers Bay. The 9 months of travel that had been crossing the Australian continent had left the 10-man expedition team fatigued, running low on rations, and yet again in the need to search for water. The expedition party made their way back from Chambers Bay south following the same route, arriving back in northern Adelaide on the 9th of December 1862. But about 1,000 kilometres before arriving at their home, McDouall Stuart's health rapidly declined. He was suffering from the scurvy and malnutrition which everybody had been facing during the expedition, but also had trachoma in his right eye, leaving him practically blind. He was so fatigued as well that he had to be carried on a makeshift stretcher the last 1,000 kilometres to Adelaide. John McDouall Stuart never really recovered from his final expedition through Australia. In 1864, he returned back to Britain, initially just to visit his sister, but ended up living here. 2 years later, John McDouall Stuart passed away on the 5th of June.
McDouall Stuart's final resting place would be here, in this very tomb, located at the Kensal Green Cemetery in the London Borough of Kensington, 20 minutes from his final resting place, his home in Camden Hill Square.
When passing through Alice Springs, one may discover the statue of John McDouall Stuart in the aptly named Stuart Park. Now, McDouall Stuart crossed through the centre of Australia in 1860, like I previously mentioned. But Alice Springs, as it would come to be named, was discovered only in 1862, and it was the name of the water source, the water spring that was in the local area, and its source was the Todd River, the arid Todd River. Both of these natural landmarks were named after Charles Todd and his wife Alice. Now, Charles Todd was the main driving force behind the overland telegraph network, soon to be completed in the 1870s. Now, the settlement that developed around this water source was called Stuart until 1933, when it was name changed to Alice Springs as we know it today. Other natural landmarks that were named after great friends and patrons of McDouall Stuart was the Fink River, just south of Alice Springs, named after the financier William Fink, who funded a lot of McDouall Stuart's earlier expeditions. And then further north towards the top end of the country and continent is the Catherine River, named after the daughter to the great patrons of McDouall Stuart, Catherine Chambers. Now, McDouall Stuart's legacy goes beyond the statues and naming the geographical landmarks after friends and patrons alike. And it even goes beyond the exploration side of things and the European understanding of the Australian continent. Within 10 short years of this famous trek through the centre to the northern point of the Australian continent, the South Australian government took ownership of the Northern Territory and established a northern settlement known as Palmerston, today called Darwin. And just a few short years later, an overland telegraph network was established connecting Australia to within itself, but also to the wider world and the wider British Empire that it was part of. Even when it came to the development of the railways tried to follow a near exact route that had been taken by McDouall Stuart on his great trek through the centre. And even the Stuart Highway, named after McDouall Stuart himself, was based around a route that McDouall Stuart had taken in 1862. So this isn't just a legacy of exploration at a time where explorers were amongst the most famous of faces. This was a legacy about the development of a nation that we have come to know and love today. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you have a good day, and I shall see you next week. Bye.